Hi, Dave Coplin here, bringing you another Rise of the Human special. This week we've got another fabulous author of this book, Audacious Goals, Remarkable Results. Really, really superb book. I'm going to cut straight to the chase, introduce you to our guest today, who is Brad Borkan, one of the co-authors of the book. How are you doing, Brad?
Great. It's great to be here, Dave.
Well, listen, I'm so glad you could join us. The thing I love about the book is you've brought together three iconic figures from history and trying to underline what we can learn from them in our modern lives, specifically in modern businesses. You picked on an engineer, a statesman, and an explorer. I'm going to leave you to explain who and why. But look, just give us an overview of the book. Audacious Goals, Remarkable Results. Tell me a bit more about what the book's about.
Well, it was great fun to write this book, and it is a book that evolved. It wasn't what we originally planned to write about. My co-author and I had previously written a book about the life and death decisions the early Antarctic explorers made on the ice and what we can learn from them for modern day decision making. And that book's called When Your Life Depends on It, and that was quite successful. And we thought, let's move on from that and do something that goes beyond Antarctica and talk about other endeavors, other great endeavors. And what happened was we said, well, we brainstormed and we thought, well, let's write about 11 things. And we just thought, well, 11 just seemed like a good number. And everything from the invention of early railways, how tunnels were built under rivers, how the Panama Canal was built, how things like the Northwest Passage was achieved, or people got to the South Pole, or people got to the North Pole, or got to Everest, got to the moon, got to early aviation, early automobiles, like all-terrain vehicles. And we started putting all this together, things like national parks, and we just had brainstormed this down to 11 things. And what happened was something quite remarkable and very unexpected. Was we kept seeing three names reoccurring. And those three names were Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who is a British Victorian era engineer, Roald Amundsen, who is a Norwegian explorer from the early 1900s, and Theodore Roosevelt, who was an American president. And it was just like this eureka moment that we had. That was these three unique individuals. And we thought, and we immediately stopped writing. And it was all right at that point. We said, let's write about these three guys because they're so fascinating. And that was
That's
basis
really, really amazing sort of process that you must have gone through. So to get to 11, and I love the fact that you chose 11 as a number, presumably because 10, everybody does a top 10, and 9, there doesn't seem to be enough, right? But you could have gone on forever.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And what's interesting about the three individuals is they kind of, they're a similar era, but they don't necessarily overlap, or they don't all overlap, do they?
That's correct. Brunel was born and lived in the 1800s. So he died before either Theodore Roosevelt or Amundsen came on the scene. But they were all big influences in their eras. And one of the things that struck us about what they did, not only did each undertake at least 2 of the 11 things on our list, and that was one of the surprising things, was that each one was fundamentally instrumental to those 2 big endeavors, but they also influenced several of the other endeavors. And it's just like, what was unique about these people? And it was one question we had. And also, what were some of the similarities between them? Because one was Norwegian, one was British, or French and British, half and half, and one was American. And also that they have these 3 very different professions, and yet they influenced the world in a very profound way. And they influenced our modern world. It's not like things that we can say, oh yeah, that happened a long time ago. We wouldn't see one of those things. It's like we go through tunnels all the time. We take trains all the time. We go to national parks. The goods we buy come through the Panama Canal. These things are massive and important.
Yeah, it's incredible that you can still see the legacy of these people today. So I guess what I'd like to do, Brad, is if we could just talk individually about each of these people, just an overview. But then I think there's something interesting about the common traits that I think they share, having read the book, and what we can learn from those traits today, and where we look for them in modern day business. So let's start with Brunel. Now, look, I mean, I grew up in the UK, and Brunel was kind of, high up on our curriculum. I can remember as a kid being taken to see the SS Great Britain, and as an adult, I spent a lot of time commuting in from Reading to London. So I'm familiar with his handiwork. Let's just talk a bit about Brunel, and why was he so pivotal to you in terms of being one of those one of the three key people that you chose to focus on?
Okay, well, before we do that, let's take one little step back, because it's important to realize how famous Brunel is in the UK. He's totally unknown outside of the UK. He's not known in Norway. He's not known in a lot of Europe. He's not known at all in America. Most Americans have never even heard the name. And one of the things that struck us about this was, how do we get his name and his accomplishments into the general public, and into American culture, because he's so fundamental to how we get around in the world. It's quite remarkable.
That's really curious, because I mean, we'll get to this a little bit later, because I had a similar feeling about Roosevelt, because I was reading about him, and of course we didn't study Roosevelt and American presidents at school. Perhaps much to our disappointment. And so for me, it was learning. I learned more about Roosevelt from watching Night at the Museum than anything else, right? As a non-American, which I'm not sure is a great credit to me. But anyway, we'll figure that out. So I think it's interesting, because you're having to bring these characters to life to audiences that maybe don't know them as well as others. Interestingly, we all know about Amundsen, though, or maybe actually there's a bias, isn't it? Because I know about Amundsen partly because of the Northwest Passage, but mostly because of the Antarctic rather than the Arctic. Anyway, let's go back to Brunel and let's talk about bringing him to life.
Okay, great. So what was remarkable about Brunel was the first big endeavor he did was the Thames Tunnel, and that was done with his father. His father was an engineer of quite a lot of fame, and at that point, I mean, you got to think about London today versus London in the 1820s. London today, you go across the Thames, and it's a lot of pleasure boats, and there's some river taxis, and it's not that that is trafficked compared to the roads. The roads are very busy in London, but the river is comparatively not. It was the complete opposite in the 1820s. The river was the biggest port in the world. Many of the world's goods went through the ports of London, and it was just wall-to-wall ships all across the Thames. In fact, there was even a saying that you could actually walk across the Thames just walking from ship to ship just across the bows of all the different ships. And there were bridges, but basically the docks were very crowded. Unloading ships were very, very time-consuming. And to move goods, you had to then move the goods by horse and carriage across various bridges. The trouble was you couldn't interrupt the river traffic, to build more bridges. So the question was, how do you build a tunnel? And then the question becomes, how do you build a tunnel under a river, a flowing river? Because as you know, and hopefully your listeners realize, that the Thames is tidal. So water comes in and water comes out on a fairly regular basis, but it puts an uneven load across the riverbed, and the riverbed is made out of silt and sand and gravel, so it's not like digging a tunnel through rock. And so his father invents what's called a tunneling shield, which is a structure in which the workers stand in, and it's described in the book, and there are a few pictures of it. Basically, the most important, perhaps the biggest takeaway from this about this tunneling shield was Brunel was the engineer on site. Isambard and Brunel, the son, was the one who was in the tunnel day after day working. They were constantly in fear of flooding. They're constantly at risk of toxic fumes. The Thames was the sewer of London for 1,000 years. And so this is a lethal, dangerous, people getting blind, dying, the workforce is dying. It was terrible conditions. And he's in there day after day working with the workforce. And what's remarkable, not only it did eventually get built, but it is the tunneling shield technology is the same tunneling shield technology that's used today for building tunnels. And it's almost unheard of.
It's incredible. And I wasn't
things.
Brunel's father's inspiration from that, from a worm, watching a worm.
Right, exactly. He picked up a piece of wood in a dockyard. He had always been puzzling about these various engineering problems, and this seeing a worm that basically bored through wood and sort of built a structure behind it. It secreted a liquid behind it that sort of formed a casing for the hole so the worm could get out or move through the wood and not have the wood collapse on it. So, and you basically designed a similar thing using the brickwork and it was very clever.
To me, what I love about that story is just how much we can learn from the natural world in engineering and science. And there's lots of examples, but it was great to see that brought to life. So he built the tunnel, which was amazing. Talk a bit about the railways, and then I want to get into some of the sort of the attributes that made Isambard so special at the time for what he was doing.
Okay, the railway and is fascinating because the railway there were railways that had been built. So actually, what's interesting about our three men in the book is none of them were pioneers in the sense of being the inventor. They were not the person who was the first person to do something. They're the person to take something that was there and build it further and really rethink it and shape it into something that was different and more valuable. So Brunel had there was a railway from Manchester to Liverpool, but it was basically just this one line. And Brunel's he gets injured in the tunnel flood and ends up recuperating. Actually, the tunnel flooded numerous times, and at one point he nearly dies, which is very exciting. That's the way the book starts. This incredible adventure where he's running for his life. But he recuperates in Bristol and gets to know a number of the Bristol city managers through various engineering works that he's involved in. And they want to build a London to Bristol line. And it would be the longest train line in the world. And he decides it should also be the fastest train line in the world at that point in time. And his view was the way you build a fast line is you basically connect two cities without a lot of stopping points in between. And you find the most level route possible because trains can't go up and down the way a car can over. And so the challenge is the terrain, and the British terrain is undulating is probably the best word to describe it, and intersected with lots of rivers and streams. And so you're constantly building bridges and at some points tunnels and cut throughs through hills to build this line. And he surveys, I think this is one of the many wonderful stories. He surveys the entire line on horseback and comes up with the best route. It takes 10 weeks. He comes up with the best route, which is still the route the line uses today for high-speed trains. It's
incredible,
amazing things.
Yeah.
The other thing. Sorry.
No, go on, please. Go.
I was going to say the other thing to add to this is very quickly is that people said of the tunnel, there were 50 engineers who said that during that day when they're building the tunnel after the first flood of the tunnel, they said never be built. This tunnel will never be built. You will never ever be able to build a tunnel the size that you're contemplating under the Thames. And people said the same thing about the railway. You'll never build a train line of any speed, of any quality. It's just these things are going to be rattling. They're bone rattling, awful journeys. And he set out to do it. And it's a fascinating story.
And what I found interesting about the story that you told in the book is, to me, it's kind of one of the first examples of user experience led design. Because he's there building a railway, but he's not thinking about the mechanics of how do I get a locomotive from one place to another. he's thinking about, well, who's sat on the locomotive and what's their experience going to be like? From the smoothness of the ride to the appearance of the stations and the layout of the stations, which I just thought was really amazing in terms of this focus of customer outcomes, to use modern business language, I guess. Is there something that we could learn from that? Is there something that non-engineers should learn from that when they think about business and they think about what they're building?
It's about seeing the design as a complete whole. Like he was very interested in, as you're saying, the customer experience, but also thinking about how is this thing going to look 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? And every station on the line is a different architecture. He didn't like cookie cut this thing. And if you go, a lot of train lines in America, you look at them and every station is sort of the same. It's sort of like almost the same designer. It's like, here's the station. And I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. So here's the station that we have in Princeton. And here's the station we've got in New Brunswick. And here's the station we've got in another part of New Jersey. And they're all similar, where these were really different architecture. And he was leaving a legacy, and he designed Temple Mead Station and a sort of Gothic style, and other stations and more modern styles and other stations. And even the entrance to tunnels were uniquely designed. It was looking at things in a broader perspective. He was very interested in elegance.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book, and I hadn't read this before, but he saw the world through 7 dimensions, and this is what I learnt. So he's got the engineer's view of physical dimensions, length, width, height, but also he had how quick can it be built, how long will it last once it's built, how soon can we get revenue, and then the last one, which I loved a bit, and you just mentioned, is how elegant is it? He's like the Johnny Ive of his time. Do you know what I mean? We could build it, but it's got to look great. It's got to feel great. The experience is great. And I just thought that they were great principles for us in business as we design things. And that last bit about elegance is the thing that I think we often either forget or throw overboard because, we're just trying to get by. Elegance is something that we can't afford.
That's absolutely right. And that he just saw the world in a different way. But it's interesting you mentioned Johnny Ive, because the connection with Apple was quite interesting in that in the early days of computers, as we all know, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and people, they were young men doing these things. There were young people involved in the computer industry. And what's surprising about the railways is it was young men doing these things. They were in their 20s designing railways and designing locomotives, and literally very, very young people changing the world in a very big way. I would venture to say that almost every train ride anyone takes has been influenced by Brunel.
Yeah.
And that's anywhere in the world. Any time that you're going on a line and you're going on a train line from one city to another, from one location to another, and you need to say, oh, I'm actually not going from London to Bristol, I'm going from London to Windsor, for example. You've got to change lines. He had this concept that you have the main line and you've got the trunk lines. Well, someone had to come up with that idea first. I know it sounds, wouldn't that be obvious? But it's not obvious until someone thinks of it. And then, of course, it seems obvious.
Yeah, but it's not obvious in like 18, whatever it was, is it? I mean,
Exactly.
This is the thing. This is the thing for me about Brunel. And I think for all of the three, as we'll go through, is they could see things that other people couldn't. And it was kind of not even the next step. It was the N+1 step of where we were today. And I want to come back to that because I think that's crucial to the world that we're in right now is, and there's that famous thing about when Henry Ford goes to the bank to get a loan and bank manager's like, seriously, man, nobody wants a car. You look out the window, they're all riding bloody horses, come back when you've got something for a horse. And he's like, you don't get it. It's that kind of mentality about how do you move the conversation on, which also speaks to your point about these guys. Brunel necessarily wasn't an inventor, but he was able to able to build on what people had done and take it further, which is another sort of key attribute. Okay, so look, I'm going to leave Brunel there because what I want to do, if we just
Okay.
quick overview of all of these individuals, and then we really want to get into. There's lots of themes that are shared between them that I think are really cool. So, I mentioned to you that Roosevelt is somebody that I'm not really familiar with. So it's really interesting for me to sort of try and put him at the same level of achievement. Like if we were playing, and this won't translate, Brad, I don't know how long you've been in the UK, but into Top Trumps, which is basically a card game where everybody has an attribute and you try and figure out who's got the best attribute in a given category, right? So in the Top Trumps of Brunel, great achieving people in the world's history, Roosevelt wouldn't be somebody that I would have put at the top, but you did. And so I'd really love to know a bit more about why why he was such an important part and would be in your top three.
Well, that was one of the startling things, was that we could sort of see why Brunel was, but Roosevelt was a complete unexpected gift in a sense when we started doing when we made up this list of 11, that we started making these spreadsheets of time and dates and who was involved, and his name kept reappearing. Like, well, that's interesting. There were two big endeavors that struck us. One was the national parks. That he didn't build the first national park. He didn't actually build that many national parks, or declare that many national parks. But he created a lot of national forests. He protected a lot of land in across the United States. He had this vision and he was a Republican. He had this vision that big business and developers and everyone was pillaging the land and clear cutting trees and mining and doing whatever they could do to take advantage of whatever land and make whatever riches they could. And he saw this as a great heritage that was being lost. And he was determined to use legislation to protect it as much as he could. The other thing was the Panama Canal. He came on the scene. For those who don't know, he was governor of New York State, and he was sort of outspoken. And I guess some of the other Republicans and things thought he was a bit annoying. So they said, well, we know what we'll do. We'll get him to run for vice president along with McKinley. And then as vice president, he can't do anything because it'll just be a non-figure. It's a non-figure. It's just a figurehead role. And so he's a young man. He's in his early, he's at that stage about 40 years old. He runs or 41 years old. He runs with McKinley. McKinley wins. Roosevelt becomes vice president. Within 6 months, McKinley shot and killed. All of a sudden, Roosevelt's president of the United States. He's 42 years old, youngest person ever to become president of the United States at that time. And he's got this vision of the United States as a world power. Now, it's interesting that us being in Europe, we think, well, the United States has been a world power for a long time, and Europe has lost its dominance. But up until the 1900s, Europe was the dominant player, and America was not. And he saw the canal as that was the focal point to get America on the world stage. America as a benevolent force to manage the canal, and it would just improve world shipping and put America at the forefront. So
if you think at the time, I would imagine in that period, America would certainly still be quite inward looking. So, early on in the evolution of the country, trying to figure out its role in the world, got everything going north of the border, south of the border. And then here's this guy who's starting to think, well, hang on a minute, how do we break out of this and get up on the stage? So again, another sort of visionary individual.
Absolutely. And he was like Brunel, he was like a visionary who took action. He wasn't a visionary just like, well, I'm president, I'll have all these ideas but not know how to do them. He was someone who actually put himself on the line, just like, it wasn't quite as cool as Brunel being in the tunnel, literally risking his life every day, but it was similar in a way. He was risking his political career every day, championing the canal, championing the
and to be fair,
preservation of land.
He did get shot, didn't he? And then continue to deliver
that was
a speech.
Later. Yes. Yeah. Certainly. Assassinations were pretty commonplace, and yeah, he did later. After he was running for president again, he does get shot and nearly killed.
One of the things that I really
dangerous sport.
Yeah. One of the things I was interested in the Panama Canal, again, not really a subject that I've ever spent a lot of time thinking about, was, you're building this incredible feat of engineering, but in somebody else's country, and even more complicated than somebody else's country, is actually in a combination of countries who haven't figured out that they're going to be different countries yet. So, the whole thing that's going on there. So he strikes me as someone who was able to build consensus with people who he didn't necessarily have control over. So he had no control over, what was going on in Panama or around where the canal was, but he was able to influence that. Do you think that was one of his key attributes?
Yes, that's a really good observation. He was very good. He had two really phenomenal skills. One was the ability to recognize that I don't have to agree with someone on every single point to work with them. A good lesson. That's a good lesson for business. I was going to say,
there's a lesson we could do with learning today, isn't it?
Yeah. He was a phenomenal orator. He just could inspire people with words. And he could paint visions of what he was doing and what he was trying to do. And his speeches are unbelievable. They're as inspiring today as they were then, talking about glorious triumphs. And it's up to people who to be the man in the, well, he used man, but should use person in the arena, being the person in there trying to do things and achieve things, and not to hold back and either be timid or be a critic. He had no time for people who are just firing shots from, being in an op-ed section of a newspaper saying, "Oh, he shouldn't be building a canal. It's a wasting U.S. money." He's like, "Hey, I'm in there doing it," and it's two very good skills.
No, exactly. He we'll come to this more with Amundsen, actually, but I think he was aware of his limitations, wasn't he? I mean, he sought to have people around him that would help him understand things that he had no experience of, such that he could formulate the right approach, which again is something that I think is really crucial in modern business today.
He was really good at listening to people. He was good at hiring people. He was good at listening to them. And there's so many wonderful scenes from the Panama Canal. One very quick one is the workers were dying of yellow fever, and going back there before the U.S. got involved in trying to build the Panama Canal, the French were trying to build the Panama Canal, and they failed miserably doing this for 8 years and spent tons of money. It was a disaster, and the workforce was dying of yellow fever. And when the U.S. comes in, they start doing exactly the same thing the French are doing, and the workforce is dying, and this is just a horrible condition. And they do have something called the Canal Commission, which is going to control costs. And there's just 7 men on this Canal Commission, and there's Dr. Gorgas, who's hired to be in charge of. At that point, it was like the medical community in the Panama Canal Zone for the U.S. And it was the common belief that sanitation was the problem. That's what caused yellow fever, bad sanitation. He had practiced in Cuba, so he understood that bad sanitation that it wasn't bad sanitation, it was mosquitoes that were causing yellow fever. And so he goes to the Canal Commission and says, "Give me $1 million and I'll solve that. We'll kill every single mosquito in the canal zone." There's a 50-mile long, 10-mile wide canal zone. And they turn around and go, "No," right? That's what their dots was. They gave, "We'll give you $50,000. It's still big money in those days. But so he goes to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt listens to Gorgas, and he thinks, "Well, where am I going to get that expertise? How do I figure out what's true and should I listen to the Canal Zone Commission? Should I listen to Gorgas? Who's right?" So he goes to his personal doctor and the personal physician for the president of the United States and says, "What do you think?" And the doctor says, "Well, if you want the canal built, then fund Gorgas's plan completely." So this is the biggest health initiative ever undertaken in the history of the world at that point. And he funds it for $1 million. And yes, indeed. I mean, it's one of the most unbelievable things you can imagine, to think you could actually kill every mosquito in the canal zone and all the larvae and everything. And they do. And at one point he brings some of the other doctors into the morgue of the hospital. He says, "I want you to see something." Shows them a dead body on the morgue table and says, "That's the last human being who will ever die of yellow fever in the canal."
Wow.
And it was.
That's incredible. And
Incredible
just
story.
orient me. What year are we in when that's happening?
That's around 1906, 1907.
1906. That's just incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible. It's they're big endeavors. They're big undertakings, and people just not thinking, not being constrained by someone saying it will never be done. It can't be done. You're just talking nonsense. That they're just like they didn't have time for the naysayers. I think was a good way to
Yeah,
think about
well,
it.
I like that. I also, and I'm building on that. One of the things that you taught me in the book was he had this sort of lesson that he learned about hiring people who think strategically but act tactically. And I was wondering, that really resonated with me. And I wonder if you could unpack that a bit and sort of, and then bring it to focus in modern business.
Right. I think that so just as a way of a background for me, I worked in high tech, so I was sort of similar, not as high powered as Dave, but
You say
had
that.
worked for Oracle and SAP and not just inside the company, but working with our clients, and so got to see a lot of organizations, the insides of a lot of organizations, and you have lots of people who are very good strategically and lots of people who are very good tactically, and very few people who can do the both. And that was true. I think that's true in every organization, but Roosevelt especially was keen on understanding the detail. And I think this is something that's quite interesting, that we think of people who are either just detail experts or they're the leaders, and they're not often the same. And he was like, he wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of it. He wanted to understand the engineering of the canal. He wanted to understand how it was going to be built, how were they going to kill all the mosquitoes, how they were going to do all this stuff, and he was big into detail. They said he read a book every single day he was
Wow.
in the White House, which is pretty incredible,
Yeah,
given
yeah.
how stressful his job would be. He
That's
was he was
incredible.
an avid learner.
Yeah. Okay, so look, that's wonderful, and isn't it funny? I feel like we're doing these great people a disservice because we're sort of, you've got 3 seconds. Tell me about why, Brunel should be,
Right,
Anyway, but we are, and we're here, right? So it's not breakfast
right.
television, at least. So look, let's move on to Amundsen.
Mhm.
He certainly needs no introduction in the UK. I think we still bear a grudge against him. I'm not sure, actually. How dare he not play by the rules of exploration at the time? But let's talk about him. I mean, what an incredible man. Tell me again why Amundsen would stand out to you, and again be the sort of the third person that you would choose out of your top three.
What was interesting about Amundsen, and since Dave, you said you have an interest in Canada, that what's fascinating about the world, if you go back to the world in the 1600s, and that you had Europe and you had Asia, and you had this great desire to trade goods between them. The only way to get from Europe to Asia was either you're going down the bottom of South America, which was incredibly dangerous because of the very rough seas, the rocks, the winds, the storms, or you're going underneath the bottom of Africa, which is similarly very stormy and risky for ships. And there was this idea that you could sail across, somehow find a sea route across northern Canada through all the various islands and through all the ice formations. That somehow you could sail a ship through this, and you'd find this sea route called the Northwest Passage, and that was for their trade between the two continents. It was an ambitious thing, and the greatest sea captains and navies of the world sought this. I mean, so you talk names like Cabot, Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson died trying to find the Northwest Passage.
And we're
Sir John
talking
Franklin.
over a period of hundreds of years, aren't we? As well, it wasn't just a Victorian sort of folly. It was for a long time. Am I right in thinking as early as maybe the 15th century, 16th century?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was desired almost from the day that America was discovered.
Yeah.
That that Columbus discovers America. That people are like, gee, okay, now we need to somehow get across that. But actually, interestingly, jumping back to the Panama Canal for a minute, similarly, the Panama Canal was sought from the minute Panama was discovered by Balboa. So you've got these two ventures of people trying to traverse the world
Yeah.
in different ways, and Amundsen comes on the scene with decides he's the man to do it. What's interesting about these guys is he decides he's not only is here's the problem, he's the guy to do it. Brunel was the same with railways. There's a problem with how do you make railways safe and efficient and smooth. And he's just, I'm the guy. And Roosevelt the same with the Panama Canal. I'm the guy. This is almost my destiny. And so same with Amundsen. And he puts together a small team and actually does it. Takes 3 years for them to pursue it.
From a young age, though, wasn't it? I mean, he realized quite early on in his life that I'm going to do this.
Yes, it's quite remarkable. I wouldn't have thought that, from a young age. Roosevelt was saying, going, I want to build a Panama Canal. Certainly.
How do you wake up in the morning and think, you know what, actually, Northwest, I'm going to do the Northwest Passage? You're sitting there in, presumably, rural Norway somewhere, windows open, freezing, and you're like, do you know what? That's what I'm going to do. It's just...
But that is what he did. Because Norway had Nansen, who was a great, Friedrich Nansen, who was I'm sure I mispronounced that, Friedhof Nansen, who was a very well-known explorer first across Greenland. You take an expedition across Greenland. So he's inspired by people like Nansen, and Norway is also a very new country. And so it was owned by Sweden, it was owned by Denmark at points and Sweden at points, and it's coming on the stage trying to be its own nation. So it's looking for heroes, and he decides he's the guy. He's going to do this. And he does.
And he does. And see, what I find interesting about his approach, though, and again, so viewers will know that I love Canada. And as a result, I got quite sort of fixated on John Franklin, who tried to do this, in the previous century, I think. It was like 50 or 60 years before. I mean, my history is terrible, but before. And yes. Franklin, to me, and this is probably a caricature, but he strikes me as what would have been the very sort of the statesman of the empire back then. We're British. We know everything. We will do this because we're British. In fact, we will be successful simply because we are British, and we'll turn up with all of our ships and everything. And Amundsen's kind of like a lot more humble in his approach. And whereas I think Franklin, and his team and people of his generation and his era would have been less inclined to listen to people around him, especially indigenous people, whereas Amundsen seemed to be just a sponge. Like, what can I learn from the people around me? Who's doing things that will be useful to me? How do I get access to them? How can I learn? How can I bring that in? It's very different. One of them is a bit more, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it's sort of an arrogant, sort of self-centered, we've got everything we need, thanks. And the other is, I know that I don't have everything I need. I know I can't do this with my own knowledge. How do I build a team around me that helps me get there? Do you think that's fair, or is that just me being a little bit parochial?
No, that's exactly right. And he also, and I think this also goes back to the way Brunel approached life, was, I'm going to rethink everything. So he looks at the Northwest Passage, and first of all, he becomes an expert. He reads all the books about Franklin. He reads all the books about the Northwest Passage ever written. So he knows more about the Northwest Passage and all the attempts than anybody else on Earth probably at that stage. And he's looking at every single aspect of the journey and thinking, like, how do we improve that? How do we deal with the cold weather clothing? How do we deal with what sort of ship should we take? What do we need to do to achieve this? And just like Brunel did with the railway, we need to relook at locomotives. We need to relook at train tracks. We need to relook at what a station is like. We need to rethink the whole shooting match. And he's doing the same. He's saying, well, everything that was done before, it's fine. Let's learn from it, but doesn't mean we repeat it.
Yeah. Just incredible. I also, there's something about Amundsen's approach, and look, this is more about, well, I suppose it's about both things, but he figured out that small and nimble can sometimes achieve more than, lots of people, lots of resources. I mean, I was astounded to read in the book was that he did the Northwest Passage with 95% less equipment than Franklin had attempted and failed. I mean, just, either you're massively confident at that point, or you're ignorant as to what may be, but you're plucky. Do you know what I mean? It's incredible.
Yeah, and there again, people said you'll never do it. You'll never do it. The ship's too small. The ship's too late. The ship's too few people.
Yeah.
But actually, in the Northwest Passage, at times there's almost no draft for the ship.
Yeah.
You're literally skating over. The ship's really sailing in a foot of water or less,
Yeah.
and so you need a different type of ship than would have been.
But it's, not wishing to push the metaphor too hard. It's about agility, isn't it? And I just when I read about Amundsen and how light he travelled, it kind of reminded me of the myth about the Jeff Bezos 2 pizza rule. I don't know if you've come across that, but basically, if you can't feed your team with 2 large pizzas, the team's too big. Which is pretty
same with
good.
the South, and the same with the South Pole. I mean, his team to the South Pole ended up taking 5 men, 4 others to the South Pole, but his whole team on the Fram heading to Antarctica was much smaller than Scott's, and much smaller than any other British expedition. But then they weren't trying to do the science that the other teams were doing.
So let's break out of the individuals and let's look at the collective. And I've got just some questions about the traits that I think they all share. The first is, what was curious to me is if you look at these 3 individuals, they were early achievers. So they're all quite young when they're doing a lot of these great achievements. But also, so Brunel was the son of an engineer. Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family. Amundsen was part of a maritime family. So it's kind of in their blood. So the question I kind of wanted to ask you, do you need to be born into great achievements, or can they be curated? Is it nature or nurture?
That is a really good question. It's something that my co-author and I contemplated a number of times, because it did feel like, are we saying to people that you need to have had a father who was in the profession? And I guess my argument against that is Amundsen had brothers, Brunel had brothers, and these people came from big families, and their brothers didn't do this, they did this. Yeah. So what was it that was uniquely in them? And I think it is something that is a unique sense of purpose and passion. And again, jumping back to our strategic versus tactical, that they just saw the world in a different way than everybody else saw it. That when Brunel's building the tunnel, there's this 2-mile stretch between Bath and Chippenham where to get to his level line, he had to build a tunnel. Now, at that stage, no one had ever built a tunnel of that length. And he's like, well, it's going to take us 5 years. I'm going to start one end to the other end, and we're just going to start tunneling through with these and they did it. And it's just these things were they just had this passion and perseverance that the job needed to be done, and they were the guys to make it happen. And they basically the 2 teams, they tunnel in 2 years, and they meet right in the middle, and they're off by 2 inches.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Dead center. This is just incredible. I think the Channel Tunnel may have been off by more.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Channel Tunnel's a lot longer, but
even so, I think you talk about passion and purpose, and I really think that's crucial to their story, and crucial, I think, to people wanting to make similar achievements today. There's something about youth as well that I was trying to unpick. Was, again, they achieved quite early, and I just wondered if there's anything about being young that makes a difference here. Is it that you aren't encumbered by experience? I find as I get older, I tend to not do a lot of things because I'm like, nah, that'll never bloody work. Whereas when I was younger, I'd be more keen to jump in, oblivious to the things that may go wrong. So is it about being young, or are there things that we can learn from the approach that actually, irrespective of our age, will help us achieve greater things?
Well, definitely being young helps. I always think that young people feel like they're immortal. So they're a bit like they're indestructible. So whatever happens, they can whatever damage they can do, they can recover from. But interestingly, and I think one of the great traits of Amundsen, Brunel, and Roosevelt that we weren't expecting as we were working out the stories in the book was they all kept achieving, even into later life. Now, none of them lived to be really old, and our book's not a biography. It's not going like, here's the day they were born and here's like the details of their early childhood and things like that. It's more focused on these big endeavors. But in this, it's interesting that Amundsen goes from building the tunnel and the railways to building big ships. and building the biggest ships in the world. And Roosevelt leaves the presidency and goes off on these hunting expeditions across Africa, and then does this expedition through parts of South America. So he's like off exploring, and he volunteers to actually, and when he's later in life now, he was approaching 60. He volunteers to go to World War One. He's just, this guy is just sort of indestructible and out there doing things. And Amundsen still was exploring, and he was keen to go to the North Pole and gets involved with early aviation. The first person to start flying planes in the polar regions. It's age wasn't a barrier to them. They just had this passion to keep going. I think their passion was never to put their feet up. It was just.
I think if you're wired in that way, though, you can't. Do you know what I mean? It's a restless spirit, I think, is one of those, one of the attributes of those. Let's change gears slightly. One of the things I found really compelling about the story of each of the three individuals was how important failure was to actually drive them further forward. And I think one of the things that we underestimate the most in modern business is the positive power of failure. I don't think we deal well with failure. Talk to me about, what did they do? How did they, I'm trying to think what it was. I mean, Amundsen had several sort of abortive attempts to find the Northwest Passage. Brunel, the floods that he would have experienced, the cave-ins in the tunnel, but they came back stronger. What's going through their mind, and what can we learn from that? How do we use that in today's business to embrace failure a bit more readily?
Wow, that is a big question. The way I think about it is this, which is where most people think about the endeavor of being the finished thing, and that's what you're striving for. So you're striving to finish the tunnel, you're striving to finish the railway, you're striving to finish the Panama Canal. They didn't see it that way. They were striving to change the world, and so failure was just part of the process, because the process is not, oh, we'll never get the canal done. The process is, look at what we're going to do when the canal is finished. Goods from the west coast of America can get to the east coast of America without going through the bottom of South America. Goods from the east coast of America can get to the west coast of America. Same thing, without going through across the rough seas of South America. And the European trade, as the country's developing in the early 1900s, San Francisco and California becoming very important, but can't trade with Europe because it's so hard to get goods across. And so this is they're not, the setbacks are just setbacks. They're not, you're still striving for this big benefit. And
so it's the audacious goal, isn't it? I mean, and I think you use that phrase a few times as well as
and the title
the title of the book. But it is it's being brought into that vision that makes all of the difference. The other thing that really I enjoyed seeing was how curiosity and learning played a part in all three of their stories. They all three, as individuals, seemed to be insatiably curious about the world around them and the things that they were doing, and always open to learn. At any point on their journey, they're trying to learn more. Which I thought is such a great lesson for us as we're trying to navigate this incredibly complex world that is changing, and I know everybody says it, but it really is difficult. If you're a business right now trying to figure out, I mean, God, when I started doing these things, we used to talk about the post-pandemic new normal. Well, God knows we're beyond that, but nobody still can't figure it out. So it's what can we learn about what's going on? Do you think, again, that's one of the key hallmarks of these individuals? To have achieved these things, you have to be open to learning and be curious in order to be as successful as they were.
Yes, very definitely. I think they were constantly trying to figure out new methods, new approaches. Everything they were doing, they were trying to learn from and rethink and get better at, and delving into detail. I think that's one of the key things that I think people are shy away from now is details for other people, details for technicians, details for for a group of engineers, or Roosevelt, the story of the locks, because originally they were building a sea level canal. Basically, you dig a big trench, you let the seas fill it. That's the Panama Canal, and ultimately they realized that's not possible. The canal will never get built. And at one point, it was predicted that it'd take till 1927 to build the canal, which would be like 20, 30 years to dig this trench. And it's just so difficult to do. And so they go to Roosevelt with this idea for the locks. And he delves into the detail. This is the nature of these people.
Yeah.
They're not afraid of the very great detail they're going to need to learn to master. And because he's going to have to sell it to Congress.
Yes.
So it's
and it is. I mean, it is interesting because so often, don't we, as leaders, don't bog me down with the details. Just give me the summary. And quite often,
right.
I think we miss all of the context in doing that. So I'm just, conscious of time. So I want to go through some quick fire stuff, actually.
Okay.
Imagine we had let's get Bill and Ted, right? So we've got a time machine and we're going to build our dream team. So I've got Brunel, Amundsen and Roosevelt on the same team at the same time. Is that a dream team or is that going to be an unmitigated disaster?
Now that's a challenging question. That's a good question. I don't know. I think they're a dream team in that they all thought alike in that regard. They approach problems in a similar way, and they focus on solutions. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were team players in a sense. They were each leaders. I mean, Amundsen wasn't looking for team consensus in how they approached the Northwest Passage or how they approached the South Pole. He was the leader. He could take input from various people, but he was still the leader. Roosevelt as well was a leader like that, and Brunel as well. So I think, maybe they would clash.
Yeah,
go on. Sorry. The one thing I'd say is they had different levels, different expertise, and that may have helped if they stayed to their engineer, explorer, statesman craft.
Exactly where I got, and this never works, right? But if you are able to imbue them with the respect for each other's knowledge and experience and get them working together, that would be fantastic. I don't think the temperament of any of them would have made that work. So again, quick fire. I'm going to talk to you about some big problems that the world faces. Who would you want on your team to solve them? So let's start with the pandemic. Brunel, Amundsen, Roosevelt. Who are you picking to walk you through get you out of the pandemic?
Now that would take all. I'm going to dodge that question and say that would take all three of them. The way I see the pandemic is, and one of the big conclusions of the book is that you need to be an explorer, an engineer, and a statesman, and you need to look at all problems from those three perspectives. So the pandemic, very much exploring for solutions for vaccines, treatments, things like that. You've got the engineering. How do you actually produce vaccines that can go to billions of people? And the statesman craft of how do you actually get the political will to make that happen? That is definitely if we had those three guys, we could achieve a lot.
It's fun. I should have thought that through, shouldn't I?
Because
it wasn't because it's the right answer, but I should have thought it through because my next question is who would you want to solve climate change? But I think you've just answered that. It's the same challenge for me. I'd want Brunel figuring out how are we going to do all of this stuff without killing the planet. I'd want Roosevelt selling. Getting other countries to, look, we've all got to do this, we've all got to play our part. And then Amundsen would be interesting because I think he would be the one that would be exploring sort of different ways of achieving things and also cutting through a lot of the noise. I mean, if you think about he was an individual who was not used to a lot of frills in his life, if you know what I mean. He was quite happy just to crack on and do what needed to be done. So that was my read of the three and how they would approach climate change. Do you share that? Do you think there's a different approach?
No, I think that's right on. That's spot on.
And then my other one, and look, this is a loaded question, right? Because I've clearly got an opinion. Brunel, do you reckon he would have built HS2? If he was here today, would he be building HS2?
What's your guess? Do you have an opinion?
Well, funny enough, I do, Brad. I might have an opinion on this. I think even today he'd be turning in his grave if the fact that we were contemplating a high-speed train. He would be looking about, what's the a more relevant way of achieving the same outcome, and he would be looking to that, which I suspect wouldn't be a train. And may not even be moving people from point to point, but maybe moving data from point to point. And I say that as a technologist, but I think this sort of, I think he would be incredulous at us trying to solve that solution using the same technology that he pioneered a couple of 100 years ago. I don't know. I mean, I am as a technologist, I'm incensed by the whole thing, but.
That makes sense, because one of the things that's wonderful about the train he did build, because he wasn't saying let's put trains everywhere, but he did pioneer that at the very beginning when they were starting to do cable messages, being able to send a wireless message, a wire-based message from point to point. The first installation of that was across the Wardenclyffe Viaduct, which you can see today. So it's over near Hanwell and near Ealing, and so this wire-based communication method was first used from point to point from London to Hanwell, and that ran along the train line.
I hadn't realised that until I read your book. And what an impact that had made. I actually hadn't connected that with the thought I was having about HS2. So Brad, look, two very quick summary questions then. You picked three incredible individuals from a lot of history with great achievements. So we've got Brunel the engineer, we've got Roosevelt the statesman, we've got Amundsen the explorer. Who are their modern day equivalents? Who do you think that we will, our subsequent generations will be writing Audacious Goals number 2? Who are they going to focus on from our era, do you think?
Now that's a good question, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of adventuresome things. Certainly Elon Musk comes to mind, and Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, a lot of the classical people try to do work in. Our interest was in people who worked in multiple different endeavors and pioneer in multiple different endeavors, but also brought a lot of creativity and ingenuity. They weren't necessarily nice people, and they weren't necessarily people that you might want to be friends with. So I think it's important to understand that we're not holding Roosevelt and Amundsen and Brunel up as saying these are role models that people should as human beings, because they had flaws like everybody, and you could definitely throw stones at each of them for various things that they did, but at the same time they achieved greatly, and I think that's one of the great lessons from it.
It's interesting. Your point about not necessarily being nice people. You have to be able to be a bit different. I think, to think as different as they did, and Jobs is the classic example, isn't it? And probably Musk today. If you want these, transformational outcomes, you need people who perhaps think in transformational ways. Where I want to leave it, Brad, is. We talked about the age that these people were at when they found their passion and purpose, and they were clearly in an environment that helped that to flourish. They clearly they were self-starters. It's not like they've got people paving the way for them. One of the things that concerns me is that we don't do enough in our society to inspire young people to become a Brunel or a Roosevelt or an Amundsen. And I just was interested in your perspective. What could we do? And especially, I mean, I was going to say let's get specific. Let's not necessarily get specific. But if you look at the sort of the individuals, but also when it comes to diversity, how do we encourage people from different, genders, backgrounds, races, parts of the world to become these great achievers? What could we do?
Well, Roosevelt had this wonderful line that was "dare mighty things." And if I think about what are the three most important words in the English language that anyone needs to learn, it it needs to be those three words, that you need to have the audacity, the conviction, the ability to just dare mighty things and go off and try to do them. And I think those don't have to be as big as going through the Northwest Passage or the Panama Canal or building railways. They can be much smaller, but they're still in your own sphere. That concept of what's the mighty thing I can go after? What's the mighty thing I can dare try to do and go do it? And Roosevelt did these wonderful speeches about things. And the remarkable thing is that's the motto that was used on the parachute for the Mars rover, which landed on Mars in February 2021. And the parachute that descended the Mars rover, called the Perseverance, and the parachute had this embedded code in it. And that code said, "Dare mighty things," the exact quote from Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's wonderful, isn't it? And that's such a great message. I just feel if we could equip, young people in their education to dare mighty things, I become less worried about climate change or problems like the pandemic. If we've got people who are confident, as those individuals would have been, the three people that we've talked about today, to tackle some of these phenomenally complex and huge challenges, giving people the ambition, the confidence, the ability, and through the attributes that you've listed, the ability to learn, the ability to be curious, the ability to listen to other people. These are the things for me, I think, are really set us up for success. Brad, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on. I'm really, really having, as you can see, the book has been enjoyed and written in. I used to never write in books, but it's my new hobby. I quite like writing with a red pen too, not spelling mistakes, I might add, just things that are poignant to me. So thank you so much for joining us, Brad. It's been a real wonderful opportunity to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Dave.
So that was Brad Borkan. His book is Audacious Goals, Remarkable Results. You know where you can find it. I really recommend it. It's not only are there lots of great lessons for what we need to do in business, there are also some great stories about three great individuals at different times in our history. That's it for now. It's been great that you could join us. As always, if you enjoyed the show, you know the deal. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, or even you can subscribe to us still on YouTube. That'd be great. And I will see you again soon.